In our Kings and Generals animated historical documentary series, we are describing the wars and battles of the past, so naturally we decided that some of the tactics used in these battles deserve a longer, more in-depth view. For now, we are going to start with 10 tactics of ancient and medieval warfare that we consider most prominent. This video will allow us to gauge the interest, and if we get some, we are going to produce comprehensive videos for each of these tactics. Let's get it started. The oblique order was one of the biggest improvements made in the ancient Greek warfare. Before its implementation, hoplite formation usually fought head-to-head, and the fate of the battle was decided by the number of ranks and the quality of the units fighting. Epaminondas was able to change that forever in the Battle of Leuctra. Epaminondas concentrated most of his troops on the left flank, while his center and right were deliberately weakened, and while his left engaged the right flank of the enemy, his center and right slowly retreated. Theban left easily won against their counterparts, and Spartan army had to retreat. For this tactic to work, weakened part of the army should reject the engagement as long as possible and retreat closer to the concentrated unit to support and protect its flank and rear. This tactic is sometimes called the penetration of the center, and the basic idea is to use your most elite units to create a gap in the enemy army's center. After this gap is created and enemy forces are divided in two, reserve should pour into this gap and exploit it. The first battle of Chaeronea between the forces of Philip of Macedon and the Greek alliance was won this way. The general who attempts this tactic should know his and enemy units well to conclude which of these units can crush their counterparts, and if it fails, the army implementing it can be encircled and crushed, as it will have no more reserves to cover the flanks. This tactic can also be dangerous if the enemy has a reserve force that can close the gap and counterattack. Hidden flank is another variant of the oblique order, but it doesn't demand the concentration of all forces in one place, and also doesn't weaken other parts of the formation as much, so they do not have to retreat. Caesar used this tactic during the Battle of Pharsalus against the Senate and Pompey. He had hidden a group of infantry behind his cavalry on the right flank, and when Pompeian cavalry on the left flank attacked, Caesar's cavalry supported by the hidden infantry crushed their enemies. This maneuver left Pompey's infantry exposed, and soon it was encircled and had to flee or surrender. For this tactic to work, the center and the right of Caesar had to endure, and they did just that, giving their general one of his biggest victories. This tactic was used by the Carthaginian general Hannibal during the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC. His weakened centers retreated slowly under the pressure of the enemies, while his wings moved forward and engaged the Roman cavalry. Hannibal was sure in the superiority of his riders, and they delivered. The Roman center lost any support, was surrounded and crushed. This tactic demands efficient movement, precise implementation, and the presence of elite troops that can overpower their counterparts. The biggest danger of this tactic is the possibility that non-elite units in the center may lose morale and flee the battlefield. The crescent formation is another form of the inverted wedge, and it was used by the winning side during the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. In this battle, Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan positioned his flanks closer to the Byzantines, while his center lagged behind. Byzantine army outnumbered Seljuks and was pressuring it. The center of Sultan's army slowly retreated while his wings moved to stretch the opposition. Emperor's forces were chasing, and they slowly lost their cohesion, and that allowed mobile Seljuk units to encircle their right flank and then the center. Mobility and good communication were crucial to the success of this tactic. If executed precisely, this tactic leaves enemy chasing and destroys the cohesion between its units, and they become easy pickings. The feigned retreat is fairly easy to understand in theory, but it was difficult to implement. In the Battle of Pydna, whole Roman army retreated slowly and was chased by the Macedonian phalanx. Roman general used the retreat over the hilly terrain, as that broke the cohesion of the Macedonian army. This allowed Romans to mount a swift counterattack that caught slow enemy force lacking maneuverability flat-footed, and isolated phalangists were killed or routed. On the other hand, during the Battle of Grunwald, only one flank of the Polish-Lithuanian army retreated, and when the corresponding flank of the Order's army stopped the chase and went after the center of the Allied army, its flank returned and encircled a portion of the Teutons. This tactic is high risk but also a high reward. Retreating units should be highly trained and organized, have good leaders, and efficient communications with other units to pull it off. Hit and run is a variant of a feigned retreat, but there are some important distinctions. This tactic was mostly used by the nomadic people or by the forces predominantly consisted of horse archers. The Battle of Kera and Edessa are prime example of its implementation, as in these two engagements big Roman armies were utterly crushed by Parthians and Sassanids. While feigned retreat demanded a continuous withdrawal and then one swift counterattack, hit and run was more nuanced, as there were a number of retreats and counterattacks throughout its implementation. For these tactics to work, army needed to have an assertive mobility and maneuverability to prevent enemies from catching up and entering the pitched battle. Small units were moving back and forth, and at the time poured the enemy with hails of arrows. That killed and wounded enemy troops and tired them, which eventually made them an even easier target for the horse archers. Cantabrian circles and Parthian shot were important elements of the hit-and-run tactic. Single or double envelopment is a pretty standard tactic that can be considered an element of the oblique formation or a hidden flank, but it was often used outside of these tactical formations. The basic idea was to engage all enemy forces and leave one or more mobile units that will outflank the enemy on one or both sides and will strike behind. This tactic is one demanding patience, as the general should wait out his counterpart and not move for envelopment before the number of options Roman legionaries were able to execute were numerous. For instance, During the Battle of Zama, they used what was called manifold channels to allow Carthaginian war elephants to pass through, and after elephants were dealt with, legions formed into one single extended line that allowed them to outflank deeper but narrower forces of Hannibal. Obviously, only the best trained warriors of the world would be able to pull that off. It's possible to talk about Roman armies for days, but let's stop it here. This video is already too long. These were our favorite tactics of ancient and medieval warfare. Which would you choose to crush your enemies? Like, share and subscribe, and don't forget to check our Kings and General documentary series. This was Nurix and Phoenix channel, and we will catch you on the next one.